Today we will talk about the history of jazz from the outbreak of World War II to the present day. The beginning of the story is in my previous video, A Brief History of Jazz Volume 1, which I will link in the eye and in the description box below. It takes you from the evolution of jazz in New Orleans to the 1930s, the big band era. Now on to our story. The outbreak of World War II marked a turning point for jazz. Swing music of the previous decade had flooded the nation and become the pop music of the decade, challenging other music for cultural supremacy. Big bands reached their height of their success in the early 1940s. They traveled with the troops over to Europe and became big successes over there as well. The war hampered many of the musicians' efforts, though. Conscription took a lot of musicians away from their bands. The military's need for shellac, commonly used for pressing gramophone records, limited record production, a shortage of rubber from the war discouraged bands from traveling, and a demand by the Musicians Union for a commercial recording ban limited music distribution between 1942 and 1944. Bands enlisted musicians too young for conscription, bringing a lot of new blood to the scene. These young musicians started experimenting with a more up-tempo, improvisational style of jazz after hours in small clubs and in apartments. They collaborated and experimented with melodic development, rhythmic language, and harmonic substitution, leading the way for a new type of jazz called bebop. These new performers began to shift jazz from something straightforward and danceable to a more challenging musician's music. Most influential bebop musicians included saxophonist Charlie Parker, pianist Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk, trumpeters Dizzy Gillespie and Clifford Brown, and drummer Max Roach. Bebop divorced itself from dance music, establishing itself as an art form and the musicians as artists instead of entertainers. Bebop is based around the harmonic devices not previously used in jazz, with a more abstracted form of chord-based improvisation. Bebop scales are traditional scales with an added chromatic passing note. Bebop also uses passing chords, substitute chords, and altered chords. An altered chord is a diatonic triad or seventh chord that has one or more pitches lowered or raised by a half step. By lowering or raising, altering, the chord tone, you change the character and color of the chord. Depending on what pitches you change, you can even change its function. New forms of chromaticism and dissonance were introduced into jazz, and the dissonant tritone, or the flatted fifth, interval became the most important interval of bebop. The chord progressions were taken from older jazz standards and altered with new chords. This was standard practice in jazz at the time, but it became central to the bebop style. Bebop made use of several relatively common chord progressions, such as the blues rhythm changes, 1-4-2-5, the chords to the 1930s pop standard I Got Rhythm. Late bop also moved towards extended forms that represented a departure from pop and show tunes. Let's hear some bebop now. Dizzy Gillespie's A Night in Tunisia is one of the most famous tunes for Gillespie. It was a signature work for his bebop big band. A complex ostinato bass line in the A section is notable for avoiding the standard walking bass pattern of straight quarter notes, and the use of oscillating half-step up, half-step down chord changes using the sub-5, a tritone substitution chord for the dominant chord, gives the song a unique, mysterious feeling. Let's listen to it now. In the late 1940s, Afro-Cuban jazz began to evolve. The Spanish tinge, or the habanera rhythm, had been popular all the way back to the beginning of jazz, some postulating that the addition of the habanera rhythm was how jazz got its swing. Afro-Cuban jazz is the earliest form of Latin jazz, pushed to the forefront by Cuban musicians Mario Bauza and Frank Grillo, Machito, in the band Machito and his Afro-Cubans in New York City. Afro-Cuban jazz is a combination of Afro-Cuban clave-based rhythms with jazz harmonies and the techniques of improvisation. The clave was both an instrument and the rhythm that the instrument played. Also known as a key pattern, it is the organizational basis for Afro-Cuban music. The two main clave patterns used in Afro-Cuban music are known as in North America as son clave and rumba clave. They are slightly different and reflect different substyles in Afro-Cuban music. Let's listen to the son clave pattern first. Now here is the rumba clave pattern. In 1947, the collaborations of bebop trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie and percussionist Chano Pozo brought Afro-Cuban rhythms and instruments, such as the tumbadora and the bongo, to the East Coast jazz scene. One of the works they collaborated on was Manteca. Co-written by Gillespie and Pozo, it was the first jazz standard to be rhythmically based on the clave rhythm. According to Gillespie, Pozo composed the layered contrapuntal guajeos, or African-Cuban ostinatos, of the A section and the introduction, while Gillespie wrote the bridge. Arrangements with Latin A sections and a swung B section, with all choruses swung during the solos, became common practice with many Latin tunes of the jazz standard repertory. Early performances of Manteca revealed that despite their enthusiasm for collaborating, Gillespie and Pozo were not very familiar with each other's music. The members of Gillespie's band were unaccustomed to the guajeos, overly swinging and accenting them in an atypical fashion. While pushing the boundaries of harmonic improvisation, cubop, as it was called, also drew more directly from Africa rhythmically. Let's hear a bit of Manteca. You can hear the cross rhythms in the drums on the cowbell and the brass section, while Gillespie solos over the rhythm in a more bebop running style. The style of Dixieland had a revival in the late 1940s, driven by the re-release of older albums from the 1930s. Many musicians participated in the style revival, broken up into two camps: the older musicians that had been playing the style before it fell out of fashion, and some younger players that really took to the style. Through the 50s and the 60s, Dixieland was one of the most popular jazz styles in the US, Europe, and Japan, but it was mostly ignored by the critics of the time. The 1950s led to the creation of cool jazz, a new style of jazz that was a reaction to bebop. It consisted of relaxed tempos and a lighter tone than bebop, using a more subdued approach to jazz. It also used some trappings of Western classical music, such as form and structure. It relied heavily on arrangements, with spaces for improvisation. The term cool began to be used as a descriptor for this music in 1953, when Capitol Records released the album Classics in Jazz, Cool and Quiet. One of the seminal recordings in this movement of jazz is Miles Davis's Birth of Cool, recorded over 3 sessions in 1949 and 1950. It features unusual instrumentation, innovative arrangements, and Western classical music techniques such as polyphony. Many of the rich harmonies were developed and borrowed from European Impressionist composers. The horns are paired and given lyrical lines instead of put at odds like the style of bebop. A more lyrical approach to improvisation was also used. This use of paired instrumentation can be seen in the tune Move. In Move, the arranger John Lewis gives the melody to the pairing of trumpet and alto saxophone, baritone saxophone and tuba supply counterpoint, and the trombone and French horn provide harmonies. Let's hear a bit of it now. 1950s, bebop morphed into hard bop, a bebop style that took inspiration from blues, rhythm and blues, and gospel, especially in saxophone and piano playing. This was seen as a reaction to the rise of cool jazz. The division of the styles seemed to be coastal, with hard bop in New York echoing the frenzy of the city, and cool jazz in California with a more relaxed take on life. This led to the development of West Coast jazz, a direct descendant of cool jazz. Also developed in the late 1950s was another style of jazz, modal jazz. It replaced the chord progression with one or more modes for improvisation. If you need a primer on what modes are, I have a video that I will link in the and in the description box below. The emphasis of modal jazz was on harmony, not melody, as in other jazz styles. Historically, this caused a seismic shift among jazz musicians, away from thinking vertically, the chord, and towards a more horizontal approach to the scale, explained pianist Mark Levine. Miles Davis, always at the forefront of jazz, introduced the modal jazz concept to the world in his album Kind of Blue in 1959. The album was a series of modal sketches where the musicians were giving modes to direct their improvisation and style. I didn't write out the music for Kind of Blue, but brought in sketches for what everyone was supposed to play because I wanted a lot of spontaneity, recalled Davis. Let's listen to a track from Kind of Blue, So What? This track is composed of only two chords, the D7 and the E-flat 7. The orchestration is subtle, and the band creates an atmosphere that Davis improvises in. Here's So What, as filmed for TV. As an extension of the desire to throw off the chains and expectations from the form, free jazz developed. The late 1950s and early 60s saw a flourishing of artists wanting to completely avoid the structures of the styles that had gone before and create something completely new. Free jazz got rid of conventions like regular tempos, tones, and chord changes, relying on a more free-flowing improvisational approach. The musicians that were developing free jazz saw their precursors, bebop and hard bop and modal jazz, as too limiting. Jazz became free by removing the dependence on chord progressions and instead using polytempic and polyrhythmic structures. They emphasized emotional intensity and sound for its own sake, exploring timbres. Pharoah Sanders and John Coltrane used harsh overblowing or other extended techniques to elicit unconventional sounds from their instruments. Artists forsook regular meters in music. They kept a pulse and sometimes swung, but without a regular meter. Constant accelerandos and retardandos gave the impression of the music rolling like a wave. The name free jazz came from a 1961 album by the same name by jazz saxophonist and composer Ornette Coleman. The album became seminal in the free jazz movement, influencing later greats such as John Coltrane. Let's hear a section of the album Free Jazz, a Collective Improvisation. The album was done in one take without any editing. The single take is one 37-minute-long section of the front side of the record. It consists of what Coleman called a double quartet, i.e. two self-contained jazz quartets, each with two wind instruments and each with a rhythm section consisting of bass and drums. The two quartets are heard in separate channels, with Coleman's regular group in the left channel and the second quartet in the right. The two quartets play at the same time, creating an atonal polyphonic riff on the group improvisation of Dixieland style. The two rhythm sections provide a dense bass, which the wind players either solo or provide freeform chronicles that turn into freeform group improvisation interspersed with an atonal horn fanfares that are predetermined composed passages. Let's listen to free jazz. The late 1960s and early 1970s led to jazz fusion. It was a combination of the sounds of hard bop jazz and rock and roll, especially the sounds of Jimi Hendrix and Frank Zappa. The combination used jazz improvisations with rock rhythms, electric instruments, and the highly amplified stage sound of rock musicians. Jazz fusion often uses mixed meters, odd time signatures, syncopations, complex chords, and harmonies. Miles Davis in 1969 released an album of fusion jazz called In a Silent Way, totaling 2 extended tracks. In a Silent Way is a departure from Davis's then style and is seen as the beginning of his electronic period. Davis connected with the music of the youth of the day and reinterpreted it through a jazz lens. The album is also seen as seminal to ambient music. Let's listen to part of one of the 2 tracks, Shh, Peaceful. You can hear the addition of the electric piano and the electric organ keyboard from the beginning. Let's listen to Shh. In the mid-1970s, another trend in jazz emerged, jazz funk. Its integration of funk, soul, and R&B music into a jazz idiom, using strong jazz improvisation to soul, funk, or disco with jazz arrangements, jazz riffs, and jazz solos, and sometimes soul vocals. Herbie Hancock, who played the keyboard in Miles Davis's A Silent Way, epitomized the sound of jazz funk. His album, Headhunters, was the first jazz crossover album to go platinum. The album made jazz listeners out of rhythm and blues fans, and vice versa, with its relaxed, funky groove that gave the album an appeal to a far wider audience. Let's listen to Chameleon, the opening track off the album Headhunters. The track mixes funk rhythms like the busy hi-hat in 16th notes with the jazz AABA song form and extended soloing. The iconic funk bass line opening is played in an ARP Odyssey, played by Hancock himself. Here's part of Chameleon. The 1980s saw a return to traditionalism in jazz. In a reaction to jazz funk and free jazz, the artists of the 80s came back to acoustic instruments and older styles of jazz. The trumpeter Wynton Marsalis is seen as the spearhead of the traditionalism movement, and he strove to create music within what he believed was the tradition, rejecting both fusion and free jazz and creating extensions of the small and large forms initially pioneered by artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, as well as the hard bop of the 1950s. Marsalis sought to reaffirm jazz as a high art tradition comparable to the discipline of classical music. In 1987, Wynton Marsalis co-founded a jazz program at Lincoln Center, elevating jazz to the likes of classical music, opera, and ballet. Smooth jazz, also a product of the 1980s, also began to flourish. It was a commercial form of jazz fusion, focusing on down-tempo arrangements with one lead soloist, usually a saxophone or a guitar. It has elements of down-tempo R&B in it, which made it a good option to play on R&B radio stations across the country. One of the outstanding records in the style is Breathless by Kenny G. His 6th studio album, it was released in 1992 and went on to become the best-selling instrumental instrumental album ever, with over 15 million copies sold worldwide. The tune Forever in Love received the Grammy Award for Best Instrumental Composition and charted in the Billboard year-end Hot 100. A slow ballad, Forever in Love, makes a great use of Kenny G's iconic soprano saxophone. Let's listen to part of Forever in Love. Since the 1990s, jazz has been characterized by a pluralism in which no one style dominates, but rather a wide range of styles and genres are popular. New styles of jazz, such as acid jazz, new jazz, and jazz rap, come into play and continue to expand the definition of jazz. Acid jazz developed in the UK in the 80s and the 90s, influenced by jazz, funk, and electronic dance music. New jazz is influenced by jazz harmony and melodies, and there are usually no improvisational aspects. It can be very experimental in nature and can vary widely in sound and concept. Jazz rap developed in the late 80s and early 90s and incorporated jazz influences into hip-hop. All of these styles can be seen as the continuation of the jazz spirit, in search of new musical combinations of sound and rhythm. Jazz will continue to evolve as music and contemporary culture evolve. Thank you for joining me in the second volume of A Brief History of Jazz. I hope you had a good time listening to all the great music in this episode. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm and would mean a lot to me. My bibliography for this series of videos is on my website, dominiqueroyam.com. A link to it can be found in the description box below. Also in the description box is a link to my Patreon, where you can support the making of these videos. I want to shout out my Showstopper patrons. Because of you, I was able to upgrade my lights. Thank you so much. Support my videos through Patreon for great perks and even more music. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in my next video.